Hello. Mhm. Hello. Mhm. Yes. Mhm. Yeah. So exactly like Kay started this off, we acknowledge what is happening, and um, we all think this is a very both difficult and important time, and I think we are part of that. Like even though manga might not seem like the most revolutionary. What? Oh wow! Why? Okay. Okay, should I repeat what you said maybe? Okay. So have you double checked that your mic is connected in OBS? Sometimes they you if you don't see in OBS that the mic that your own internal mic is on sometimes. Okay, okay, yes. Okay, I go. Okay, so what we talked about in the beginning was that we acknowledge what is happening in the world. It's a scary time, but also a very important time. Even though we are just here to do a manga lesson on YouTube, and it feels very insignificant at this moment, we understand that a lot of people creators out there actually take this moment to reflect on what kind of stories do I make, and that's why we pretty much think this is the great time to make manga and try to be more diverse. And Tokyopop is working with that, and that's also what I'm doing with my mangas. So one of my mangas, the one that Tokyopop have published, Sword Princess Amalthea, includes characters of many different ethnicities and shapes and ethnicities and skin colors, which are it's a fantasy story, but I chose not to put them in a cultural context, not to put like the skin color connected to a certain group of people, which a lot of fantasy stories is about. Personally, I think that's a kind of this kind of segregation in fantasy often depicts a very colonial way of looking at humans. So in my manga, instead, humans with different ethnicities and skin colors are depicted in many levels of society and mixed in society. And the two main characters is one red-haired, fair-skinned girl, which is the heroine of the story, and one darker-skinned boy, which is actually a mix. His mother is black, and his father, I don't know. I haven't depicted him so far, so we don't know his ethnicity. But he is these two, and he's the kind of hero of the story. So these two characters pretty much, I think, symbolizes a modern youth, and how you can actually use your manga creating process in and the way you create manga to actually be a kind of protest and be a kind of I don't know, way to change a revolution or a way to change the world by just depicting new characters and depicting them in a way that you wouldn't normally see them. And we, both me and Tokyopop, support especially manga and any kind of creation that pushes Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matters movement, and gives voices to new creators and new uh, styles of characters, new kinds of characters that you don't see in manga normally. And that's really fun. So that's pretty much what we will be talking about today: how to create the story, how to. So this lesson is called. Let me double check my my little note here. How to create manga, developing a story. So we'll go through three things. First of all, coming up with an idea. Second of all, creating the world. And third of all, writing about your characters to create the characters in text. Next week, or the next lesson in 2 weeks, we will create the characters on paper, the design for the character. But today we'll focus on how to write about your characters. So yeah, before we start, have you gotten your mic to work? Yeah. Yeah. No. Okay. Well, the good thing is, yeah, the good thing is that the reason why has all changed is because your setup has changed a little bit, your digital setup. So hopefully, when we get this to work this time, we hope we don't need to do this one more time. Hopefully. Mm. Yes. Should I start? Okay. So okay. So I want to start by actually quoting Stu Levy, the boss of Tokyopop, who had a stream himself a couple of weeks ago that I watched, and he mentioned a very important thing, which is actually pretty much a summary of this lesson here. The important things in manga is CCW, which is his code for a good manga. Character, concept, world. CCW. Character, concept, world. So that's pretty much what we're going to work on today. Talk about what is a good concept for a story, how do you come up with it, how do you research it, and how do you create good characters and a good world around this concept. Because a lot of I think creators, when they think about manga, they might think about, oh, it has to be let's take a ninja and some fantasy world and let's start. But you have to I think you have to work with the actual concept a bit before you start drawing. I did that mistake a lot when I was a young artist. When I was a teen, I have a folder of about 40 stories that is just one page, manga page, because I came up with a story, and the same day I started making the first manga page, and it usually went the same way. I started, made the first manga page, and then I didn't know how to continue. I didn't know what the next step would be. I knew I had this magnificent story in my head, but I didn't know how to continue. And that's pretty much why I recommend everybody to take this first step, developing the concept and the story before you do any artwork. And that's why this lesson we'll talk a bit about stuff you can draw, but in the base of this story is actually writing, and you need to start writing. And that's also one thing I want you to remember. When you are a comic artist, you are actually equally an artist and an author. And this is something I think a lot of comic artists forget. They practice their art, but they forget to practice their authorship, their writing skills. And this part is very important, because if you don't know how to write a good story, you don't know how to develop a good plot line, a good concept, tweak it so it feels original and unique and interesting, and if you don't know how to use words to portray the story, to actually form sentences that is inspiring and interesting, you pretty much will fail as a comic artist, because a comic is equally art and text. And sure, some people can say you can use words, you can skip the words and use wordless manga and wordless stories, and that's fun. But there is something like comics in itself is the combination of words and pictures, and many times the words doesn't take as much space in the frame as the actual artwork, but they are crucial to a good story. And especially when it comes to dialogue, and when it comes to how you depict monologues, or inner monologues, for example, the wording is so important. I have met so many good artists that fail on how to write a story, and they usually use, and we'll talk more about this, about how to write, but to write good dialogue and to be able to form sentences that sound interesting and doesn't feel like cliches. This is very important. So that's why I want you all to remember that you're equally artist and equally author. And what we're going to focus on today is the author bit, to how to create that thing that you have to have before you start drawing, which is actually a story, to form a story. I also want to address one more thing, and that's the fact that I also hang out in a lot of artist groups on Facebook, for example, and sometimes, and comic artist groups as well. And sometimes in these groups, there pop up a comic writer and says, "Hello, I'm a comic writer, and I'm looking for an artist for my project, and I have this story that I've written down." And I always question, what do they mean by story? Because this is this is also one thing I want you to remember. What is a story? A story can be an idea, a story can be a short description, or like a description of a concept. A story can be a fleshed out history on a couple of pages, beginning, middle, and end. Or a story could be a full outline where you actually have created like the world and the characters and the like more deep, more in depth. It could be like chapter descriptions, like what do we mean with a story, like creating a story. It's so diffuse that we have to start picking it apart and find the different ingredients that you need to have in a story to make it complete or somewhat complete. And sometimes when I read this kind of uh, pop up like this, when these kind of posts pop up in these groups, I always think like, do this person have a full outlined story that they've been writing like a book, or is it just a concept? Is it just an idea they have in their head? Like what do they mean with story? So with that said, let's develop a story. Let's create a full story that you have that is ready for actually becoming a manga. So I'll show some pictures, but this will mostly be stuff that you need to write down. So that's why I'm using this white as a whiteboard. The first step is coming up with an idea. So last lesson we had, which you can actually find in the TOKYOPOP YouTube channel, the last lesson we talked about the different steps of manga making from the first idea to the final printed product. And now we're gonna like dig deeper into each of these steps. And this first step is the first step of a manga making process, is how to come up with an idea. So let's see here. I'll do it like this. The first step when you come up with an idea is, of course, inspiration. What like you can sit in the bus or in school, or maybe on the toilet, I don't know, wherever you find the idea. Suddenly it comes like a small bird and sits on your head and it's like picking at your brain, and you're like, oh, this idea is so good, and I just have to remember this idea. And now you wonder, what do I do with this idea? So my first recommendation is that you actually write down the idea. And I recommend you to write it down in about 1 to 5 sentences. This is like to be able to, in short, summarize the full story, preferably start, middle, and end. Sometimes that's like you don't have that. Sometimes you only have, oh, this really great idea. Like the idea I had for Amalthea, Sword Princess Amalthea, was, oh, what about making a comic in a manga in a fantasy world where the queens rule and the princes go out to rescue the prince? And I thought, this is not very original. This must exist. So I Googled it and I didn't find any stories. Like back in 2012, I didn't find any mangas that had this concept. Or 2010 actually was the first time. I tried to find, I actually did some research and I didn't find any books or mangas about this concept. So it's not very, sometimes the ideas doesn't have to be really original. It could just be the thing that never have been made and should be made. But I recommend you to check around what other stories are out there on the same concept. So for example, if you want to do a story about basketball, a basketball team, maybe check out if there's other basketball mangas that have the same concept that you have. Maybe try to be a little bit different and tweak it a little bit, because sometimes we actually might be unaware that we're inspired by something we have already read or seen.
That's a good idea.
That is, yeah, sometimes that can be like a copycat. You become a copycat unwillingly. And yeah, so that's pretty much how we work. Like creators are like sponges. So when we when we start listening to stories or seeing them on the television or reading books, we unintentionally pick up stuff we like in them and then create something own. And the question is, how much of that new that you created is actually unique, and how much is just a copy of something else? And it's okay to copy different works and make a new one, but if it's too close to one of them, it might be a good idea to change it. So by starting by writing it down and then Google or search, Google or Google what your concept. So by Googling it, it's a good idea to just double check so it's not something that's already been done. One thing I also recommend is that early on, create some kind of inspirational mind map. Inspirational mind map. And this could be like, for example, a mood board where you take pictures, or you create a Pinterest album, or I don't know, you just pick like for example, what I like to do is I create a folder on my computer, my laptop, and I just download pictures from the internet that I think fits the bill. And as long as I don't share these pictures, I can still use them as inspiration for myself. So some of them are photographs or illustrations, or especially when I do the research for my work, I usually pick up, like, I did one story about emigration from Sweden to America in the 19th century. And this story demanded a lot of research from my part, because I didn't know how does it look like, or what kind of routes did they take, or the ships, for example, what ships, like when you think about the emigration, we think about Titanic, but actually this story that I was making was taking place 40 years before that. So they didn't have steamships. They had actually sailboats, or sail and steamships. So I had to research a specific kind of boat that my character should take. And this means I have one one folder on my laptop which is just boats, just boats that fit the bill. And that's something, I mean, that kind of inspirational folders with which just contain different things, or the inspirational folders for Sword Princess Amalthea actually contain everything from pictures of like artworks, classical artwork, to a lot of, actually, there's one collection by the fashion designer Alexander McQueen, the fall collection, I think it was, from 2010, which was very much an inspiration, because the design he used then was very puffy, very Renaissance-esque, which I was very inspired by, because it felt like that was the kind of style I was after. It was modern but Renaissance, and I was like, that's kind of the style I want for the story. And that's a fashion designer. Sometimes something weird can inspire you, that doesn't that isn't manga. And that's actually how you make the story more unique, because if you're gonna make one medium, manga, and you take inspiration from other art or art forms, you will actually create something that is unique. So for example, there's a lot of manga artists that take inspiration from cultural objects, or from places in the world that is inspiring. If you have read, for example, Ryoko Ikeda's Rose of Versailles, which is a classical manga from the 70s, she was very much inspired by the whole aesthetics of the French Revolution, with the puffy skirts and everything. And that was very, very revolutionary to have in a manga style, to like use that inspiration and that classical art in manga. So that's yeah.
If I can jump in real quick, because apparently I have fixed my microphone. Yay!
Yay!
Thank you, everyone. Zoom was stealing my microphone. That was the problem. Damn you, Zoom. But I actually I do some writing in my free time as well. And one thing I've been writing recently is some horror manga where I needed to design some interesting, unique looking monsters. And whenever I see a picture on the internet that creeps me out or unsettles me or something like that, I save it into a folder.
Mhm.
And then I'll go through that folder, and after a while, maybe you start seeing patterns in the things you're looking at, and you think, oh, okay, this is my aesthetic here. This is the thing I want to work with, or this is going to be the lead thing that hooks people in my story. Like having that, like you said, like a kind of a mental Pinterest board, whether it's
Yep.
literally on Pinterest, whether it's a collage, um, pinned on your wall on a cork board, and
Mhm.
looks like a conspiracy theory board. Whatever works for you, um,
Yep.
that can be just hugely helpful to go back to and take a look at.
Yes. And especially the inspirational mind map, I recommend to include movies and music and books that inspired you, because um, the thing is, for example, if you're gonna make a really long manga, I recommend you to have like a music list, or like a track of favorite songs that got you into the mood of that story. Because if you're gonna make a really long manga, at some point you're gonna lose inspiration, or you're gonna lose motivation. And it's so good to just go back and rewatch the movies, or reread the books that inspired you, or listen to the music. Just, for example, I made one manga, it's actually my first long manga, really long manga. It's called A Song for Elise, which is actually published by German Tokyopop, under the title Ein Lied für Elise. And this one is a one shot boys love, so don't go look it up if you're not interested in boys love, yaoi. But this title is actually, the idea for the manga was very much a loss of a friend, because it's about suicide and being next to someone really close to someone that decides to end their own life. So it's a really dark manga, and in the end it was so dark and depressing for me. It was hard for me to get into the mood to actually sit down and draw. It was very much, I was reluctant to doing that. So I had one song, which is a very, it's a Swedish song, so I don't know if it's worth to mention it, but it's a really dorky song, and it's not my music taste. Like I'm actually a metal girl, and this song is very much of a cheesy pop song. But I had it on repeat because that song pretty much summarized the whole story. So I had it on repeat for the last chapters, just to get myself motivated and keep going and trying to finish the story, because it pretty much summarized my whole story in one song. And I recommend you to have more than one song, because it's really boring to listen to one song. So I did that mistake. So have a track, have like 20 songs. That
Have
is
a
your, like,
playlist.
yeah, make a playlist with like several tracks that you think is like, okay, this is the mood of the story.
Oh,
That's my
Chuneko
recommendation.
has a comment here. They say,
Mm-hmm.
"Amazing manga. It touched me so much."
Aw,
That's
thank you so
wonderful to
much.
hear.
Yeah, thank you. It's I think it's important to have good inspiration and to remember those inspirations on the way, and keep going back to them. Especially, like I said, we're like sponges, we artists, which means if you, for example, watch a new movie while you're making your comic, or you're reading a new book, you might get inspired, and then your story might tweak or change, and that's not very good for the result, for the vision you had from the beginning. So try to keep that vision in mind, and try to have those inspirations in mind when you're working on the story, and keep them close by. So yeah, that's, and the scary with your horror story, having
Yeah.
a folder full of scare pictures. I would never. No, 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 no. That sounds weird. It sounds really dangerous for your mental health to
It's
go into that phone.
I think yeah, I mean I think it depends what you like, right? And I think it's all
Yeah.
about that kind of thing is like I mean obviously if you read horror manga, you're going to read
Hmm.
Junji Ito. Everybody
Yes.
knows Uzumaki
Yes.
and Gyo and Legend
Hmm.
of Amigara Fault, which is,
Oh,
terrifying.
yes.
Um
Oh.
and yeah, I think it's whatever it is, right? If you're writing
Hmm.
a manga about cars, you've definitely got to do
Hmm.
your research and understand, if you want to write the next Initial D, you're
Yeah.
going to have to understand what you're doing. Like I'll hop in here to mention a manga that we're releasing digitally right now called The Way of Shao, which I
Mm-hmm.
really recommend. It's available on Pop Comics. It's available like digitally. You can find it on Barnes and Noble, Amazon, pretty much anywhere you get ebooks. And if you look on our website, you'll find it. Which is actually written by a London-based rapper called Shao Do. And this guy he's amazing. He knows martial arts. He's a martial arts master. He writes his own music. He writes nerdy music. So if you like rap and hip hop, absolutely look it up. You'll find references to like Dragon Ball Z, like woven into the lyrics, stuff like that. It's great. Um, but he wrote a manga about music because that was his passion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he worked with an Italian artist to make it happen and come together. But you can feel his knowledge of not just music within it,
Mm.
but also in the fight scenes. You can see he's using his knowledge of martial arts in the fight
Ooh.
scenes as well. So it's
Mm-hmm.
having that knowledge really does help.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And oh, I
Yep.
have someone here, the Empa says, Kay, I also have a board of scary stuff that scares the mind out of me, but it's on Pinterest and open for everyone. I both love and hate watching it though. You know
Ooh.
what? I'm with you on that. Mine is a private little Google Doc folder. And going through it, I sort of had to take a little deep breath every time I go through it. So I feel you on that.
I sometimes think about like, especially now when we come to the next step, which is like you say, research. So important, research. I'm gonna write it down here, and I'm gonna highlight it. This is very important. Like I always thought about like the weirdest things that, especially I think some other authors have mentioned this as well. All the strange Google searches and image Google searches that you made as a comic artist or as an author. Like I wouldn't want to read, for example, Stephen King's weird Google searches. Like you make so many weird Google searches while you're researching your stuff. Like and in some ways it's like when I do some of them, I notice that I notice Facebook is checking out what I'm searching for because
Yes.
suddenly weird stuff or popping up on my YouTube and on my Facebook. I'm like, what are you doing? So Google
Yes.
definitely knows that I'm weird and
It's
I'm an artist.
you do you end up searching
Yeah.
something like how to hide a body, and then
Yeah.
Amazon's like, hey, are you interested in shovels?
Yeah, yes, stuff like that. Like you're like, no, I'm not a serial killer. I just need to know how deep you need to dig to get a grave. It's just important for my research. Very important, I promise. So yeah, all the weird searches do that, because I don't know, there's so many artists I think that especially when it comes to manga, they think that, oh, but I just make it fantasy and I can come up with ideas of my own. If you don't base stuff in somewhat of a reality or have some kind of logic to it, it's really hard to connect to it. So remember that even though you can create these kind of magical worlds that is totally like fantasy, in the end, if the story is not approachable, if you can't approach it as a normal reader, it's gonna be uninteresting, or really few people is gonna find it interesting. So that's why it's very important to research, because when you do research, you can actually connect it to stuff that people know. And research is both research into the stuff that is gonna be part of the story. So now you go back to the inspirational mind map and to your main idea, your concept, the 1 to 5 sentences that is your concept. And you go back there and you look for, okay, if for example, if your concept is I'm gonna make an intergalactical war between a father and a son, duh. You can Google it and it's like, oh, it's not very original, there is a big story about that. Well, okay, so but you can still make it unique. So how do you make it unique? Now you have to start Googling, okay, so in the intergalactic warfare, we probably need spaceships, we probably need planets or stars or universe in some way. Do the research. How does a spaceship work? What kind of energy source do your spaceships need? Is it like, you need to do all the research you need to do, and also remember that don't make a story that you don't want to draw, especially if you're going to make a comic out of it. So if your idea is to make an intergalactical sci-fi story and you're like, I hate drawing mechanical stuff, then you have to find a way around that somehow, or skip that story, wait with it, or find some assistant or someone who wants to help you do the mechanical stuff, because it's going to be a lot of mechanical stuff, I think.
And just to bounce off of what you just said there, Natalia, which is really important. You're saying, like, how does a spaceship work? What's the power source? That can be fantasy. You can make that up. You can say, well, they run on this green energy crystal that you can harvest from this planet. The important thing is that you stay consistent. You come up with the rules of your world, you come up with how this fantasy works, and then stick with it. So it doesn't have to be, well, it runs on, petroleum, or, dinosaurs.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is also the tricky part when you're creating your story, to be able to not get stuck in the research. So for example, I want to show just quickly, when I did this story about my the emigration from Sweden to America, I can just show quickly. I had an inspirational, I have some folders with inspiration for this one, and like I mentioned, I did a lot of the research was actually just research on clothing and on places where people lived in Sweden in back then, because this is based in Sweden, then they moved to America. And for example, I checked up, for example, one thing which is very important. It can affect your story. This is why research early on in your process is very important, because one thing was that when they arrive in America, my story took place in 1881. So first of all, I did some research about 1881. What was like, how did people from Europe come to America back then? And everybody thinks of Ellis Island and thinks, yeah, that's where people ended up, in New York, Ellis Island. No, wrong. Before Ellis Island, you had Castle Garden. So this is actually where people ended up before. I think it was the late 1800, like 19th century. They changed it. Actually, a funny story, they changed it because Castle Garden is in south of Manhattan, which is part of the Manhattan Island. So the result was that every time the immigrants came to Castle Garden, outside of the immigration offices, this building here, a lot of the scammers was waiting for the new immigrants, and they scammed them of all their belongings. So the reason why they moved to Ellis Island was to protect the immigrants, so they wouldn't be scammed right the step when they stepped off the boat. But this is where my character ended up, because I was following a certain character. I actually found her on a genealogy site. So this woman that I created my story around is an actual person who actually existed, and I found her whole family tree on a genealogy site, and I just made that. And she arrived in America 1881, which was the time when Castle Garden was in use. So this is a very important part of the research. If I didn't do that research, I would have put her on Ellis Island, and people would say, wait, Ellis Island wasn't until I think was 1890 something, which means I would have been wrong. And this can be stuff that can break the whole. Like for example, in Harry Potter, in one of the early books, he gets a PlayStation. His the adoptive, or the other boy in the family gets a PlayStation, but then you realize, wait, PlayStation didn't exist, because Rowling put the books in the 90s or the late 90s or something, just to not have cell phones, but PlayStation didn't exist at that time. So, or that kind of PlayStation didn't exist. So you have to do the research, because it can affect your whole story, and then you don't want to end up having to redraw or remake the whole story. Sometimes it can be really like important things that can affect the whole storyline and the characters' personalities, just because you didn't do the research. So do the research early on, because it's going to be so much more. you're gonna feel more confident when you actually create the story if you have done the research. So when you've come so far and you have an idea, you've formed the idea, one more thing I want you to do is actually to, let's go back, wait, there. I would like to recommend you to make one sales sentence. And I call it a sales sentence. One sales sentence. I call it a sales sentence because it's, I don't know, there's probably like a better name for it, like a pitch line or something. Try to summarize your idea in one sentence that is kind of a pitch sentence, like something you would pitch to an editor or a publisher, to be able to summarize it. And this could work for any, like if your friend is asking what's your story about, they don't want to know your characters, I don't know, middle name or favorite food or like the whole history of their family tree. They don't want to know that. They want
No.
to know the sales pitch. They want to know that sentence. So
Well,
when it comes, yeah.
we actually call that in English. There's something called an elevator pitch.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
the
that's the
idea
word.
being,
Yes.
you get into an elevator and you realize you're
Yeah.
standing next to Steven Spielberg or someone like that, and you have, for as long as it takes for them to get to their floor to get out, to pitch them your idea. So you have got to be, like Natalia was saying, it's got to be short, snappy. It's got to have the main points.
Yeah.
It's got to be very quick. You love your
Yeah.
characters. You love your idea. You know your idea is fantastic, and you
Yes.
obviously you want to share that with everyone. You want to tell them why your character is going on this huge long journey and why it's so important. But they don't need to know that right away. What you want to do is
No.
hook them with the base concept, and then let them go on that journey as they read your manga. You know,
Yeah.
let them do the journey the right way rather than have it just be told to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I recommend you to actually, if you're able to summarize in one sentence who, what, when, why, and how. So for example, for Amalthea, my elevator pitch was, in a fantasy world where the queens rule with magical powers, the princesses are sent out to rescue the prince. This is the elevator pitch for Amalthea, which
Yep.
is, you realize, okay, I can see the world, I can see the characters, I can see the uniqueness of the story, and it's one sentence. It's just one sentence. If you're able to create one sentence with your story, that's how you can sell your story. Because if you, for example, if you're finally making your story and you made, for example, a simple fanzine or made your own book or anything, it's much easier to, if you're sitting in a convention and someone comes up and say, what's this manga about, to sell it with the sales pitch. If you're in
Yeah.
the elevator with Steven Spielberg, you sell it with a sales pitch. If you're gonna just if your friend asks you what's your story about, you tell them the sales pitch, and then they're gonna say, I want to read that story, give it to me. That's what you want. You don't tell them all this. Yeah.
Exactly. I have a friend. I don't know if you guys. I pitch this comic to everyone I know because I think it's wonderful. But a friend of mine, Sebastian Jones, writes Niobe, the Asunda project, which just got picked up by HBO. So keep an eye out for that. I think the
Yes.
show's
Yes.
going to be amazing. Look out for it. And this guy has got his pitch down flawlessly. When conventions eventually open up again, if you're ever at a convention and you see the Stranger Comics booth, go up and let them pitch, because I watch him hypnotize people. He slowly opens the book and starts like pulling them into this world, and within 30 seconds they're pulling out their wallets and asking how much. So if you get your pitch
Yes.
down right, it really works.
That's good.
I'll just hop in because we got LAC says, are you guys participating in the Shonen Jump contest? This is a really great point. I think we'll go over this a little bit later in the class, much further down the line. But it is worth pointing out that there are a number of contests out there for aspiring manga creators, and they are specifically made for non-professionals. You know, to get your name out there. You can sometimes you can have your comic published, your manga published by a legitimate publisher. Sometimes it's just a way to get your name out there. Sometimes they'll pick you up and say, well, we don't want to publish this, but we want to work with you to create something new. So contests like that, there's obviously Shonen Jump is very, very, very well known. But there's
Yeah.
dozens of them, and for a later lesson, we'll sort of try to assemble a little bit of a list and get them up on the Tokyopop website so you guys
Yeah.
can submit your
We can
finished
do that for
manga
the
to them.
next, yeah, for next time we can make that list and present it, definitely, I think.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm gonna participate in 2 of them. So that's gonna be fun. I'm gonna
Exciting.
participate in the Shonen Jump. I thought I have an idea, and I'm gonna participate in one called Silent Manga Audition,
Oh,
which has been
yes.
going on for some time now. So I can recommend that one as well. But we'll come back to you with a full list, definitely. So yeah, let's start working on this the world in which all this is gonna take place. So I'll create a new here. Okay, so the world. What do you know about the world? So first of all, we have the concept, we have the idea, and we want to put this in some kind of a scene. We have to set the scene for this story because it cannot take place in a void. Especially because there's a lot of things that is connected to the world that affects the character, their choices, and affect what they can and cannot do. For example, magic, for example, rules and laws that you have to abide by. And is it our world? Is it some other world? The character, the reader needs to be able to relate to the world. Is this my world or someone else's world? Is it now? Is it future? Is this history? What is this? So the first of all, of course, try to define this world in some sentences. You have the concept, the so-called synopsis. I think we mentioned this is in the last episode, the first lesson, to write down this idea as a synopsis, and try to pick out what is the world. And one thing I want you to think about is what kind of rules does the world have, and what kind of norms does it have? So rules and norms is it's not the same, but it's very similar things that you need to establish in the story, in the world. Rules could be laws, could be traditions, could be rules could be within the group. For example, the story could be about a group of criminals. They don't abide by the law of the land, but they abide by the law of the criminal entity or the criminal group organization. So there could be like different rules in different levels of the society, and depending on what kind of rules, it also affects what can the character do and cannot do, and which rules does the character choose to follow and not follow. And then we come to norms, and norms is something similar but different, I think, because norms is more about what is like what kind of hierarchy, what kind of structure does exist in this world that you're creating, or if it's our world, you have to define it. For example, what we come to right now, what is happening right now, the protests outside your window, Kay, in LA, for example, what is happening in America, it's about norms. People are talking about what kind of norms do we want to live by, what kind of norms, what kind of how do we view each other, and who has a privilege, who doesn't have a privilege, who is on top and who is kind of put down or trampled on. And this is you need, especially if you're creating a story about a fictional world or a future, for example, dystopian or utopian future. You have to decide what kind of norms is in this society is important for the character and for this world. So write down somewhat what is important. And if you think, oh, this is not very important to my story, I think there is in every story something you can connect to. So even if you have, like, take any kind of story, the Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, like even in Harry Potter, where it's about a fictional school for magicians, or or wizards, there's norms there. The norm is about the muggles and the wizards. The norms about being a good wizard versus being a follower of Voldemort, for example. That's also norms and society norms that is put by society and decided. So even in stories that is not very political, there can be a lot of rules and norms that is important for the character to know. So this is the first thing. And in, for example, my story, when it comes to Sword Princess Amalthea, of course, I decided to take the classical fairy tale and flip it over. So the rules and norms in my created world is that women, they know how to use the power of magic, because they were the only ones who could master that skill, and that's why they became the masters of the more dominant gender in the society. And that followed. What followed was an evolution to a very sexist society, where men shows or is told that they can't learn magic, and thus they are more weak. They can't, because they don't have a menstrual cycle. They are weak because they don't bleed, yada yada. Like everything is put on top of this construct of weakness or dominance. And that was, I think, what I had most fun with, is playing around with, was the norms in the society. So you can decide yourself how much that is important to you, but it's always important to decide what is the norms and rules in the society. And the next one that you have to decide is, of course, the scenery. And here you can draw if you want to. If you want to make some artwork, do that. But I also recommend you to write it down. What kind of animals or what kind of creatures lives in this? What kind of like, is this a very I don't know, urban setting with a lot of skyscrapers or buildings? Is this an old English town with that kind of scenery? Where does it take place? What's the kind of and this goes back to your inspirational mind map or your mood board. Go back there and see what kind of pictures inspired you scenery wise. So here you can either pick pictures or actually draw some if you want to. Hierarchies. I'm gonna see if I can spell this right. Hierarchies. Is this right?
There you go, you got it.
Yay! Nice. Hierarchies or statuses. Status levels. This is also important to decide what kind of structure, and this goes back to your rules and norms. What structure do you have? For example, for Amalthea, I made this kind of classical, this very feudal level where you had the royal people on top, and you had like people on the bottom was like poor people who was working or slaves and stuff like that. So I made this kind of structural levels of what levels did I have? Did I have a more military society where you had military on some levels, or like I had to make a structure of what kind of levels was there. And if you're making a story about the world that is more equal, or like where there is another kind of structure, like I chose a very feudal society for my manga Sword Princess Amalthea, but you can choose any kind of structure. Like it doesn't have to be a very hierarchical society. You have to decide what is the power structure in the society that you're creating. And last but not least, the history of the world. This is interesting. A history of the world. And I recommend you to do a timeline, and a simple timeline of the history. Actually, to be honest, I didn't do this for Amalthea. I was a little bit lazy, and I recommend you to do it. I actually had the chance to do it much later, because I made a manga between 2013 and 2015. And in 2016, I got in contact with a publisher of role-playing games, and actually had the chance to to flesh out the whole story with a role-playing game instead. So this couple of this company wanted to make a role-playing game based in the same world of Sword Prince of Maltea, and they said, okay, so now you just have to write down the whole history of the world, or write down what countries is there, or like what kind of adventure story paths or storylines can we add into the book. I'm like, I don't know that. Like, I had to sit down and just off in hindsight think back, like what kind of things could I put into the story that fits the canon of the story, that was canon. And I recommend you to do this before. Like, you can decide on how much you need to do this. Like, some people are like Tolkien, doing all like a lot of preparations, and a lot of history, or like creating languages and stuff. If you don't want to do that, you don't have to, but do some kind of storyline, just to, because one thing I really like is when you have characters refer to stuff that happened way before. For example, if you make a fantasy story and they're like, oh, like this and this queen from back 200 years ago, ha ha ha, that's a funny story. And I, like a reader's like, wow, there's more to this, but I don't know it. Like, it's almost like there is, because this is how we work. Like, we refer to history all the time. We refer to what happened before, our personal history or our country's history or the history of the world. And it would be weird in a fictional world that you created that they don't do that, because that would feel like you put them in a time capsule, like you put them in a gap in history that doesn't have a connection to anything else, and that's not good. So when you create a fictional story, make sure you have the history and you can refer to it somehow. That's my tip.
Having that framework there, it's a really good point. Having a really solid world built around, and it's again going back to the sort of the concept of the elevator pitch. You don't have to tell everyone everything. You
No.
don't need to reveal all of the details of your world.
No.
They can just be something that you know, and when you need it, if you get stuck, you've written yourself into a corner, and you're like, what do I do now? You know your world well enough that you're like, oh well, I know that I don't know, walls are built from this material, and they've got this tool with them, which means they could actually break a hole through the wall, and that kind of thing. Another thing that I do writing wise is I play Dungeons and Dragons. I'm a DM, which means that
Yes.
I create the world and create the story. And mine is completely like written by myself. And I've done a lot of research in the background that my players don't know about, because inevitably I will put a beautiful pathway in front of them that leads to the left, and they all stomp through the rose bushes on the right, and they head off in a direction I wasn't expecting them to go, which could be terrifying because that's not what I planned for. But because I know the world well enough, I can say, oh, well, you know what?
Yes.
There's a little tavern down that way. And there's actually some goblins that live over there. So I'll have them ambushed by the goblins, and then they can head to the tavern. So that kind of thing gives you a lot of flexibility within your story, because you can play around with the world that you know is there.
Yeah, and I think actually being a dungeon master for a role-playing game is a really good way to see your position as a comic creator, or an author in general, because it's kind of like that, except your characters, you can, instead of having people role-play in your world, which you can't control really, you can just nudge them. This way you can actually control the characters. But you also need to remember that just like real people, you can't force the characters to do one thing. I mean, there might be one position in the story where you tell yourself, wow, the most natural thing would be going through those rose bushes. It wouldn't be to follow this path that I created for the character. It would be unnatural for the character to do that. And then you realize, dang, I had to create that path through the rose bushes. What's happening over there? And that's why you need to do all these things about the world, to kind of dig into your world and learn about it. And if you're not creating a new world, you could be making just a story about our world. You still need to decide, like, what part of our world is this taking place in, and what kind of rules and norms, scenery, hierarchies, history do we have in this place. So especially if any of you is are creating stories that takes place in a city that you're not well acquainted with, take time to do research and write down whatever you find that could be necessary for you to know before you write your story. So that goes back to the research, but it's kind of like creating a world, but just you need to know it. So I always recommend people, they're going to create a story that takes place in a certain part of the world that they are not from, always make sure you have someone from that part of the world, or from that city, that is your mentor in this project, because it's like you're going to make so many mistakes if you don't do that, like so many
Yeah,
mistakes, and it's going to be
absolutely.
embarrassing.
We actually
Yeah.
had a great question here from LAC. Says, I think structure buildup is really important for long, hundreds of chapters type of mangas. Do you think it is as important for short mangas? And I think you touched on that really well there. I think it's less about being super in depth, and it's more about knowing your world. It's more about
Mm-hmm.
feeling comfortable and familiar with your world. Because you're correct, is short manga, let's say one volume that's maybe 5 or 6
Mm-hmm.
chapters, you're not going to be able to go in depth with all of that kind of stuff. But if you set
No.
it in, say, London, and everyone uses slang from New York City, people aren't going to enjoy that. They're going
Mm-hmm.
to be pulled out of that fantasy world.
Yeah, and especially if you're gonna make something historical or set in, like you say, a certain part of the world, we probably will have a reader from that part of the world. It's gonna be so important and vital. Like, for example, the story I told you about, this historical story about emigration. That story, it was a 40, I think it was 40 pages or 45 pages. So it was quite a short story when it comes to manga. 45 pages is short for a manga.
That's very short.
It's a
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a short manga.
Yeah.
It's not even a book. I put in 80 hours of research before I did the manga. So 80 hours of research and writing and collecting pictures and everything before, and establishing the world before, or the scenery for this story before I actually started drawing the manga. Before I even drew like one page, I had 80 hours already down in research. And that's why I think, like, even if you make a shorter story, it's so important to have created this for yourself, because it's going to be so much easier for you if you don't skip this step. But the next step, should we continue to characters maybe? Oh, one more thing. I had some maps here. This is a very, very interesting, I think, to create maps. If you're gonna make a fantasy story, or any kind of story, actually, even if it takes place in London or in your hometown, you need to make a story. Like, if it's a real city, take a Google Map screenshot and like draw where does your character live, where does he or she go to school, or what's the workplace, or which park does this character like hanging out in. Like, make sure you know these places, so it's not just a fictional story in a real setting. Like, it's weird. Like, anyone from London would notice if you moved houses around, or like, I want to have the Big Ben and, I don't know, the metro station from this part of town. Like, no, that's two different part of town. That will be so weird. You can't like push things together. You have to remember where you are.
Mhm.
And this is actually the very, very first map for Sword Princess Amalthea. So I
Wow.
actually, yeah, yes,
That's great. That's really cool.
yeah. So this is the very first one.
Yeah.
So this is the green part is Queen Galatea's queendom. The red one is the queen that is the mother of the prince Ossian that Amalthea rescues, and the red line is here is where she walks to first picks him up and then go back to his mother's castle. And then I had some blue line up here, someone else's queendom. This is in Swedish, someone else's queendom. I don't know, someone else's. I don't know. So this was pretty much the first screen, this first kind of map I did. I never intended to publish this or even show it, so this is embarrassing.
This no, it's
And
amazing. It's very cool to get to see it.
yeah, so but then I realized I need to actually know this. So throughout the
Yeah.
process of creating the story, I actually made a real map. So this is the map that is in the actual manga. I'm gonna zoom in a little bit so we can see it. So this map is a little bit more complex. Here's the queen, the castle that Amalthea stars in. She's walking up here. This is a tower she visits, and then they travel all the way down here through the mountains and to to the other castle. So I realized I had to make a more proper map at some point, because otherwise it would be really hard to like. This was so not detailed. It needed more detail for me to be able to make a good story. So making a map is very good, and I also think I recommend you to make a map, or also a layout of the person's home, apartment, or any kind of housing or building that they're going to move around a lot in. I recommend you to do that. Now, most of the houses that the characters in Amalthea moved around in was castles. So it didn't really matter because castles are just a lot of rooms. So it didn't really matter. But in, for example, if you're doing a story in in a house that belongs to the main character, if suddenly the kitchen is connected to the bathroom, but in another scene is connected to the living room and the bedroom, people are gonna question your story. Like, how did the character move in this house? So make us an actual draw the actual layout of the house. Is here's the bedroom, here's the toilet, and in this room here's a small closet. Like, actually do the work of actually making a layout for the house is so important, because it's going to be much easier. Like, where are the windows? Like, draw where you have windows, where the entrance to the house. Like, you have to draw all this to remember to be able to actually make the characters move around, and maybe they go this way and then back into the bedroom. And this will help you so much. I promise you. Do it. It's worth it. Like, you do it when you do role-playing games, probably maps.
Oh,
Do you?
absolutely. I do. I have
Yes.
my own little mental maps, and I
Nice.
have draw some maps up for people as well. There's actually it's a really good point. There is a lot of free map making software out there.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, especially for
Mm-hmm.
starting out, maybe you don't want to draw a full map like that beautiful
No.
second one that you just
Mm-hmm.
showed us. Maybe you just want to know where there are mountains, where there are rivers, where there are settlements, or something like that.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of them. They're free to use. So I'm not going to
Mm-hmm.
plug any in particular. But if you do a little bit of a search, this is where honestly tabletop resource sites are going to be great for finding that kind of thing. And then at least
Yeah.
you've got your map and you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And we actually have a couple of tips here and questions. The
Mm-hmm.
EMPA says if you have Sims, the video game, you can build your character's house there and see it from all angles and use
Yes.
it for references. I've done that. I've done that. It's
Yes.
also a really great way to design characters sometimes, like background
Yeah.
characters, things
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
And David says, besides making it big, is there a way of making a living from writing manga? I've not published any manga. I just work on the other side, so I'll pass that over to you, Natalia.
Well, making manga is it's very much of a dream. So a lot of the things around making manga, I mean, you can choose whatever you want to, whichever way you want to make your living, and if you prefer being closer to what you love, which is maybe creating stories or drawing manga, maybe the first step isn't to make a manga, because that usually is not how you earn money. We're going to talk more about this in the final lesson, which is about publishing. But in short, answer is uh, I wouldn't say that not even in Japan
Mm-hmm.
would any like mid-sized or even one of the top-sized manga artists be able to afford to just live on it. It's the few people that are employed, and that's actually very few if you compare to how many manga artists there is in Japan. So a lot of them just have shorter stories or shorter regular series, and then maybe go on and off. So a lot of manga artists, but if you talk about here in the West, there is a lot of ways to earn money still doing creations, and that is kind of like manga. Either write stories. As a story writer, you can always work as a screenwriter and a copywriter, or work with doing books. You can do anything from guidebooks or textbooks for schools to actual books, like other kind of books, like fictional work. Of course, that is maybe just as hard as kicking in yourself, you getting yourself into the manga business. It's another kind of line of work. But I would recommend, even for manga artists, to not stick only to manga. Like, for example, for me, I am a creator. I don't see myself as only a manga artist. I would like to create games. I would like to create animation. I would like to create movies. I would like to create like even music, even though I'm totally tone deaf. I would never be able to make a song. I would love to make that. And if I ever had a chance, I would probably take it, even though it would be a crappy song. Like being able to create stuff, like find the amusing part in any way. How I have survived as a comic artist, a lot of it have come from teaching, because I love teaching, and that's why I'm here. I love talking about the things I love creating. So teaching has been one of the ways I've been paid. I've worked as teacher, both employed and doing gigs as a teacher, like workshops and stuff. But as a writer, there's a lot of other gigs, and I would recommend you to actually have not only manga author as the goal, but actually to become an author, like do any kind of authoring, because all that gonna help. It's gonna help you either way. Just creating, like working on your craft anyway. Yeah, that's pretty much. If you don't want to use your craft as an income, because you maybe think that's gonna hurt your inspiration, then maybe it's good to have some kind of side job. This is totally different. I know people who work as I don't know, economists, or I don't know, anything, like lawyers, and they still do comics. So you can work on different things.
Mhm.
Should we go on to characters?
Yes, yes, let's move along. We're probably going to run over a little bit because of the
Yeah,
technical issues we had at the beginning, but we want
yeah.
to make sure that we hit all of the different points here. So yeah, let's go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next one is characters, and this is, like we said, characters. Like we said in the beginning, you remember CCW, concept, character, world. This is what we're creating. It's Stu Levy's concept, or what he thinks is a good manga: concept, character, world. And we come to the last part, characters. And now you might question, like, why don't you create the characters first? There's a reason why I recommend you to not create the characters first. It's because, first of all, of course, you can come up with an idea for a character early on, and that can be the inspiration for the whole story. But I recommend you to put that character aside a little bit, and then create the idea, the concept, and then create the world, and then put the character into that world. Because there is a risk in creating character first and getting too in love with that character, and then having a problem with picking that character apart and using the good parts, the parts that fit into the story or the world. So there's a lot of examples where I think you can notice that the character was way too close to the author's or the creator's heart, and they didn't manage to break it apart and pick out the good parts, and the character became a little bit aloof, or a little bit like didn't fit into the world and didn't fit into the story. And sometimes that's because we're inspired by many different things, and a character that you've created might be a mix of different characteristics that might fit into different characters, and maybe even for different stories. So instead of creating a good character and then creating a world around that character, and suddenly I think the character might get too complex sometimes. And that's maybe not gonna jive with whatever I'm gonna say now, because I think the character should be complex, um, but it should be complex in a world, in the way it fits into the world and the concept, if you get what I mean. So that's why I recommend you to do it this way: to start with the idea and the concept, and then create a world around it, and then put characters into that world. It's almost like if you make a theater script, first of all, you have to have the idea of the theater script. And if you just place the actors on the on the stage, and you don't know what kind of place they're in, it's gonna look weird in the beginning, and it's gonna be hard to imagine where are they? Are they in the bus, on the bus? Are they out fishing? Are they on on a different planet? I don't know. Like I recommend you to put up some kind of like scenery around them first, some kind of what do you call it when you have props in the background and these kind of paper thin houses they
Yeah,
had in Hollywood.
yeah, like some
Yeah,
scenery, some
yeah,
background. David
yeah.
is
Some
actually saying, can we give some examples? Do you have any examples to mind?
examples of characters that you create
Mm-hmm.
later, or
I guess that you would,
um,
yeah.
I would say, um, I would say it's really hard to see how different authors or creators have done it, because sometimes you can think that the character is the middle of the story, but I would say, so I don't know in which order other authors have done stuff, and I of course I have also done, I wouldn't say it is a mistake, but I've also sometimes created a character first. But for example, when it comes to um, if you take examples like Harry Potter, you clearly could see how Rowling had the idea of a wizardry school, a big power struggle between wizards. Harry is in some ways a tool to bring that story to life, and then you feel that main character, that tool, that vehicle for the story, because the characters are like vehicles for the story. You can't tell the story without someone experiencing the world and the concept and the whole story you want to pitch, you want to present. But the vehicle needs to be complex. You need to make the character complex, but you can't, if you start out making, if I wouldn't think the story would be as good if she started out creating a really good uh, main character that would be a wizard boy. I don't think that's how she started, for example. I don't think if you for example imagine, oh, a wizard boy, would you make him an orphan with a scar on his head? I don't know. I don't think that would be the first things you would think of. I think you would make him a really cool boy. Would you make him have glasses? Would you make him, I don't know, live among humans? Maybe not. I mean, there's a lot of choices I think Rowling did because she probably made a lot of the world and the story before she made the characters.
Yeah.
Because I think I've seen a lot of authors who create the characters first, and then the character become, you know what a Mary Sue or a Gary Stu is?
Oh yeah, yeah. Those are
This
very
is,
well-known
yeah.
terms, right? Yeah.
Yes, this is from the fanfic world. A Mary Sue or a Gary Stu, which is the male equivalent of a Mary Sue, is an self-insert of the author's stories. This is very typical of fan fiction, where you have, oh, I really like Edward from Twilight. I would wish Edward would be in love with me, so I create a character that is just like me, and he gets in love. He falls for this character instead of Bella, of course, because Bella is bad. And this kind of like and usually when you do that you create a main character that is way too good. Like it's and many say that Bella is actually a Mary Sue, a typical Mary Sue, a self-insert where she's pretty, she's smart, she's cool, but she thinks she's just a normal girl. And every cute boy falls for her, and she's like, but I'm just a normal girl. Apparently you're not. And that's a Mary Sue, and that usually becomes a very boring character. So I would say, mm,
Make sure that your
not to,
characters have
yeah,
flaws, right? They've got to be
yeah,
flawed. They've got to
yeah,
make mistakes. They shouldn't.
yeah,
You should be comfortable having your character make a
hmm,
decision that you wouldn't make because
yeah,
it's what they would do. That feels more authentic than thinking, well, I don't want my character to hurt this person in front of them because that would be the
hmm,
wrong thing. But maybe your character's got a really bad temper and this person caught them on a wrong day, and that's what they do is they lash out at them,
yeah,
and you've got to do
yeah.
what feels right for your character.
But
We
they have to fit into the story, into the world. Yeah.
Yes,
So yeah.
it has to work within that world. It has to make sense. And there's definitely your characters in your world are they are intertwined. You know, they're
Yes.
connected to each other and they work with one
Hmm.
another, and they should never be pushing against each other. They
Yeah,
should work in
exactly,
harmony.
exactly. Yes.
S71402 san is asking, how come if I want to develop something G or PG and not PG-13? I think all of these tips and suggestions can be adapted for pretty much any age level that you're looking
Yeah.
for. I think
Yeah.
if you're looking at something, when you say G or PG, I'm assuming you mean for kids. There's
Hmm.
obviously a whole extra level when you're looking at kids. You need to be a little bit more mindful about what's useful for children. What reading level
Yeah.
are they going to be at? But you have a children's
Hmm.
manga, don't you, Natalia?
Yes. Yes. I made one called Meow, which is about kittens, small cats. And for that one, for example, I just like you say, you have to think about I think it's good to have always to have a reference group, like a real reference group for who's your targets for this
Yes.
story, like who is the reader. And it's always good, always, and this is a very typical in any kind of story, to model the main characters kind of after the readers. So you can, for example, in manga, they usually make the main character a couple of years older than the reader. So if the
Hmm.
reader is a 10-year-old, maybe they make the character a 13-year-old. If the reader is 13, maybe they make the character 17-year-old. So they make a couple of years older because they like the idea of having a role model, or the character could be someone they would strive to become when they're a little bit older. Also because if you make a story about a 12-year-old, probably the 9-year-olds will be interested as well, because they think it's a little bit cool to read about older characters.
Yeah.
So kids like that. It's a little bit about identification. And that's what I want you to think about. The character should be identifiable. And what
Hmm.
I mean about that is that they should be unique in a way that is a person. Like a character can't just be the vehicle for the story. There needs to be, like you say, flaws and traits. We're gonna come to that. And you need to remember that it's not only, oh, they are clumsy, or they have a funny laugh. Like those are funny or interesting characteristics, but identifiable characteristics. Like we know that that girl in class who's always taking notes and sits straight, and she's like she always answers first in every question, and if you question her, she gets really mad because she's like, that archetype. Those kind of archetypes is good to use.
Hmm.
And this is also, we can talk more about it in next episode about characters, but to talk about archetypes, archetypes, I think that's how you spell it, archetypes.
See, yep,
Yeah, I think so.
yep, that's
And
right.
not stereotypes. uh,
Yes.
don't use stereotypes, focus on archetypes. And the difference is, an archetype is um, the old um, lady or man, usually gray haired with a long beard or long hair, that comes and introduces the main character to the adventure. You know who I'm talking about. Or the archetype can be the beautiful character that is uh, I don't know, alluring, or like mischievous, and allures the character into a bad path in life. That's also an archetype. They don't have to have certain genders. They don't have to have certain characteristics. They don't have to be blonde or dark skinned, or like that's stereotypes. That's when you stereotype people. When you say, oh, the big boobed blonde girl, that's a stereotype. Or the evil Arabic guy with a beard and a machete, or AK-47 or something. That's stereotypes. That's not good for your story, because that usually creates a feeling of the story being both discriminatory, but also a very lazy way of storytelling. While archetypes, I recommend you to check up on archetypes. That's where you can find a good way to write your characters, or use some kind of funny archetypes that reoccur in the genre that you're creating. So if you're creating a fantasy, there are certain fantasy archetypes. If you're creating a sci-fi, there's certain sci-fi archetypes. Check up on the archetypes of that of that genre.
And speaking of which, you can also confront stereotypes within your work.
Yes.
There's
Yes.
a manga that I personally love. It's one of my favorites, called Delicious in Dungeon. That is very fantasy. It's high fantasy. It's almost D&D in a manga. And it has elves, it has orcs, it has dwarves,
Oh.
and that kind of thing. And it will frequently sort of flip those stereotypes a little bit, or maybe the halfling or the half foot, I think as they call it in the manga. Is a little bit annoyed at being stereotyped as being a certain way,
Yeah.
and is maybe a little bit frustrated that in some ways he does kind of fall into that stereotype, and he grumbles about it. But you can actually talk about that. Like the elf can say, well, no,
Yeah.
of course I'm not like this. Why do you assume the dark elf is evil? Why do you
Yeah. Yeah.
assume that the high elf is good? These are things that you
Yeah.
can confront. And I'm just
Yes.
gonna change tacks very quickly because we did get a really good question here. Again from S71402 Tucson, who says, I have a couple of OCs, original characters, which are all cute girls who like cute things. Would it be boring if I try to make stories about mundane things such as walks, hugs, holidays, sweets, etc.? And as a publisher, what I would like to say here is we publish a couple of manga. Aria is one. If you guys haven't heard of it, there is an anime. I believe it's on Crunchyroll. And we have the manga, the Aria Masterpiece Collection, that we've been releasing, and that's essentially Aria. Aria is about it's set on Mars. We're getting into background story, how to develop a world here. It's set on an alternate world where Mars has been colonized. There's water. There's these beautiful canals, and they've created Neo Venice on Mars. And the lead character wants to be a gondolier for the Aria Company. And the stories, it's what we call slice of life genre in manga, which means it's pretty much just their day-to-day lives. So it is very much about, I suppose, mundane things. They do have some exciting things happen, festivals, things like that, but by and large, it's very calming to read. It's very nice, it's soft, it's gentle. You have these nice life lessons, you get to know these characters. So I wouldn't say that that's a bad thing. I think if you know the genre, thank you. Haloed in Red Roses says, love Aria. I didn't expect to love it as much as I did when I started reading it. It is delightful. So you can definitely write a story that
Yeah.
is slice of life, does seem very mundane, or is maybe just kind and nice and sweet and fluffy. You just need to take all these great tips that Natalia gave you about building your world, about building your characters. Just apply them within that genre,
Yeah. Yeah.
and make sure that what you're writing is solid and people will enjoy it.
Yeah, and I mean the conflict doesn't have to be like global conflicts
Mm-hmm.
or political ones. It could be just easy things as, oh no, my friend is having a birthday party and I don't know what gift to give,
Yes.
and that's a conflict of the story. Like they could be like that's what I did for the Meow, the kitten manga I made. So it's pretty much a story about cats, and their biggest issue is that they climb too high up on a bookshelf and then can't get down, and that's the conflict of one chapter. Like, oh no, that's what cats does. Like
Yep.
they climb too high and then they're up there meow meow and want to come down. So I mean the conflict can be pretty much anything, and the characters, they can still follow all these rules that I'm saying, but I'm setting up, but they can also be all these rules can still be in a very simplified or a very sweet way, So making the characters identifiable doesn't mean you have to make one character evil and one character good just to differentiate them. Both can be very cute and good, but maybe one of them is more shy and sweet, and one of them are more happy and enjoying and extroverted. That's very identifiable differences between them, and that's a way to create characters, I think. And that's why you need to check into archetypes and not stereotypes, because there is a lot of like happy archetypes. You don't have to have the evil ones if you don't want to. But
Mm-hmm.
names are also important. And the names should reflect the world, of course, and the concept. So if the world, for example, when it comes to Amalthea, the world is somewhat of a fantasy story in a somewhat European fantasy world. A lot of the scenery is actually from Portugal, because my father is from Portugal. So when I visited him in the summertime, I asked, or his family, I asked them to bring me to different castles in Portugal. So a lot of the castles that the characters in Amalthea is living in is actually from Portugal, which is fun because I've been to that castle. I've been standing in the same place as Amalthea. It helps a lot for inspiration for me. So remember to. So for me, it was important that the names in Amalthea was identified as European or somewhat European, but not necessarily British or German. Amalthea, Galatea, Dorothea, all those are actually Greek goddesses or part of Greek mythology. But still, that was a very popular thing to name your daughters or sons in the Renaissance era. To Greek and Renaissance, and the whole Renaissance was inspired by Greek and Roman empires and such. So I think it fit into the Renaissance aesthetics that I was after, and that's important. Um, One thing, open and secret um, goals, 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 and needs. Every character, or especially the important characters, should have open and secret goals and needs, and they should be open. It's about if they're open for themselves. So, for example, a character can have an open goal, which is I want to become the coolest ninja in the world, but also a secret goal for themselves. It could be in real, I just want to have friends. In reality, I just want to have friends. That's my inner secret goal. Is I don't know it yet, but I will realize it through the story. And needs is the same thing, but focusing on needs instead. So an open need is, oh, I need to get more strong. I need to get more muscles to be able to become this super ninja. But the secret need is, I just need to find empathy. That's the goal of the story. Like maybe it isn't muscles that is important. Maybe it's important to learn how to feel the other character's feelings before they come at you. I don't know. That might be a good in a fighting manga. I don't know. So open and secret goals and needs, especially for the main character, because this is part of the character development. But also for every important character should have these, because that can make characters become rivals or become friends, depending on if their goals and needs is the same or different. Some characters become friends and then turn out to become enemies, and different. Some characters become stay friends, and then in the end they turn on you and become an enemy, or yeah, they just fit. You can have different combinations. You also need to have motivations and values. So the character needs to have a motivation to do things. Maybe they are homeless and need to find a housing, somewhere to live. In Amalthea, for example, it's this push because she is the second daughter and she needs to go out on this quest to find a prince. And she's pushed out there. That's a motivation. Even though it's a force, it's still a motivation to go on this journey. Values can be more depending on what do the character value. So some characters in Amalthea is a group of bandits. They value money, they value strength, they value. Um, uh, they don't value law, for example. They don't value following the law. While Amalthea, she values equality for herself. She wants to be equal, like treated equal, because she always been the second daughter. So she thinks it's unfair that she's been treated this way. But she don't see, for example, she doesn't value the equality of other, for example, men, because she's always been on top as a girl in this society. So you have to remember what's the values of the character. Do the character value? Do they value family, or do they value money, or do they value friends, or status, or whatever? So remember to create this. And this is just writing. Write down everything about the characters before you start drawing them, because this will help a lot when you create the character designs. So next time in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about character designs, and I will ask you to repeat these things. Complexity, duality, contradictory parts of the character. So complexity, and duality. So the character needs to have. It can both be a character that believes in the law but sometimes breaks it, or a character that thinks they're really, really good, or have a really high self-esteem, and then at some points just break apart, just fall apart, and feel that they're useless. And that kind of complexity and duality, that's humans. That's human. So that's how you create a good character that feels human. And to be contradictory sometimes, that the character might say something in one scene and then 2 scenes later it breaks that rule. And maybe even that could be one thing that the friends say, wait, but you said you were supposed to do this, and they're like, oh no, I don't care about that anymore. That kind of contradictory parts, that's also how we humans are. So make the character not always following their own path. And we're going to talk more about that when we talk about creating manuscripts. And not the least, and the most important is uniqueness. I call it uniqueness. This is very important when you create a character, to make the character unique. And this is not only in, oh, it has a cool hairstyle, but how does the character speak? How does the character move? How does it have any tics? Like, for example, in Meow, my cat manga, there's 2 main cats, Ville and Vanilla. And Vanilla, she always ends her sentences with saying meow. So she says, how you do, meow? What a nice weather, meow? She's like that. She always ends her sentence with meow. And that way, it actually helps me when I wrote the dialogue, because that way I always knew which character was speaking, because she usually ended her sentences with meow, or her lines with meow. And that's a good way, I think, to make the story, to make the character interesting. And like you said, if the whole story takes place in London, make the characters use slang words of that part of the world, and also depending on what kind of level in society they are. So maybe if they're more posh, they would be using certain slangs. If they're more like I don't know, living in closer to the streets, or more street slang, and that would be a certain part of the character. So that's very important as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, that this is a good character, I think. If you like, there's many more ways to create a character, and like I said in the beginning of this lesson, remember that you're equally author and equally artist, and you have to practice your craftsmanship as an author as well. So there is so many good books. I can recommend some, but one of the ones I would recommend actually is the one I use for doing Sword Princess Amalthea is the Anatomy of Story. Oh, story by John Truby. And I like this book. It's a screenwriting author and teacher. He actually, the whole book, why I like it is because each chapter has an exercise, a writing exercise, and when you finish the whole book, you actually written down the whole story of your concept. and I can recommend it for new beginners, but I also recommend so many more books. Just finding books, going on YouTube and looking for screenwriting tips and for writing tips and author tips on how to create good characters. All those things are important for you. Remember, you're an author also, and you need to practice that craftsmanship as well.
Fantastic
Yeah,
advice. That's awesome.
we've been
Thank you
speaking
so
for a long
much
time. I'm
again.
sorry.
No, this was amazing. This was great. And now I'll do it for the third time. Now that you guys can actually hear me, I'll actually do the apology here for why we were gone for a few weeks there. I moved is one thing that happened, and it definitely changed a lot of things. So we had to get all set up again and get back into things. So apologies for not being around for a little bit. We are back on schedule now. So moving forward, next 2 weeks time, we will have lesson 3 for you guys. I have the renewed schedule up on our website on tokyopop.com/manga masterclass. The link to that is also in the video description down below. And of course, you can find Natalia's social media. You can figure out where to take a sneak peek at Sword Princess Amaltea and pick up your own copy if you haven't already. It is available in print. It's also available digitally. Highly recommended. Of course, if you have any questions, anything that you sit up at 3 a.m. tomorrow and think, oh gosh, I should have asked them that, you can go ahead and send that to me, that's Kae, at tokyopop.com. And if it's something I can answer, I'll answer it. And if not, I'll be able to pass it along to Natalia for you. This series is all about getting input from you guys and getting your help with knowing, whether we're telling you the right stuff, whether there's things that we've maybe forgotten to put in here. I doubt it because Natalia is fantastic at this, but just in case, don't be shy.
And I like to
come talk
talk
to
a
us.
lot. I'm sorry.
Well, we're both a bit chatty, aren't we?
Yes, yes. Well, so at least you have a lot of things to do now with
yes.
writing. Write a lot, and for 2 weeks from now, we're gonna create some characters.
And definitely go away after this and really start thinking about your world. Really start constructing these points that Natalia's made. The whole point of this class is for you to kind of follow along with it and hopefully put these things into place. So start up your little mental Pinterest board or your little Google Drive folder or whatever you want to do. Put your images, put your inspirations in there. Start thinking about where you want to set your story, start thinking about the characters, and the next class is going to be going more in depth into character creation, right?
Yes, drawing.
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So you can start thinking about that stuff now, and then keep adapting it as we move along. But thank you again for joining us, and we hope this was useful. Hopefully, this means we've worked all the little bugs out of the system, and hopefully next week we'll start off with full sound and good connectivity, and everything will be in place. You're very welcome, Chuneko. Chuneko says, thank you for this lesson. I learned so much and ready to work more with my future work. So that's awesome. That's what we love to hear. And thank you so much, guys. We will see you again in 2 weeks.